Hey, this is John Willis with the Global Transformation Office at Red Hat. Myself, Andrew Clay Schaefer, Kevin Bear, and Jay Bloom. Each week we're going to do a crowd chat. So just to show you what it looks like here, so if I share my screen. So this is one we did today. This is the 23rd of June, and it's just a great conversation. It's basically just a massive blast Twitter, and we had a couple of hosts here from Red Hat, and we're going to try to do one every week, so we'll put out some news. And then also, we're going to post, each week we'll post a video, so we'll actually have a video on Zoom going, so not only are we doing the tweet streams, we're going to be also doing sort of videos, so we have the conversations as we're tweeting. It was just a lot of fun, so I think we got up to about there's like 51 people on the tweet stream today, and then we got, as people start to get aggressive about sort of replying, we invite them into the Zoom channel. And then so we had I think up to 7 or 8 in the Zoom channel, maybe 10. So that was really fun. And I'll post that video. So anyway, thank you. Look forward to you joining us next week. Look for the hashtag DXChat. Here, it's right there. DXChat is the hashtag we'll use. So thanks again.
I was talking to Shebnor a little bit about what social technical systems have to do with digital transformation.
That's a good question. Post that, man.
Yeah. Sure. I think, like there's a history behind kind of the question, which is that originally a lot of the original kind of ideas about work design, so socio-technical systems theory is kind of is based in a theory that you're going to design someone's work, someone's job design. And a lot of the original stuff that Trist and some others were reacting to was kind of scientific management theories. And there's two things in particular that they were reacting to. One is what he called the technocentric version of job design, where he basically meant that the goal of designing a system was to adapt the human being to the machine. And one way of thinking about that is just that people weren't particularly good at making machines at the time. There was no kind of concept of kind of human-based design. So you would just kind of try to make the machine work, and then you try to figure out how a human being needed to interact with it. And the second part is, so that's a kind of the technocentric version of it. And the second part of it was the idea, which actually goes way back all the way to Plato, of what the division of labor and what's called one man, one task theories. And the idea of that is roughly that you should subdivide work into little pieces that one person can do well. And so the socio-technical part of socio-technical systems, socio points specifically at not individuals, but social systems. So socio-technical systems theory is based on team, organization, and even, larger social issues, and the way that work design impacts all those things. So like the original kind of study of the minds that Eric Trist did, one of the things he spent a lot of time commenting on was the way in which the design of work changed in mines and changed the way that those people who worked in the mines were able to afford to live in their communities and the effect of that on their communities. So socio is much bigger than I think a lot of people think. Anyway, so when we talk about kind of transitioning digital transformations, one of the things we're talking about is changing the way we design work for people and the level of analysis that we're doing. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question.
One of the primary problems I always view with air quote scientific management and the single task theory is that it really limits your response repertoire when you have a problem.
That's right.
If everybody only knows how to do one thing, when one of those cogs falls out of the wheel, there's literally nothing that can replace it. So the system becomes very brittle on failure and requires a lot of micromanagement from above, where you typically have terrible old information and a lack of understanding.
Hey, John, invite Furrier into the Zoom.
Okay, yeah, will do.
So yeah, I think that like just the notion of completing whole tasks, like understanding what the work is and being able to kind of divide that up, maybe not like in some cases like democratically, but kind of with the eye towards, hey, learning is a human right. So if your job is just pure rote repetition and you aren't learning anything new, then you're kind of becoming a machine or you're serving machines. And so think, like, for me, one of the big things that we don't talk about in transformation is how do we want to feel from a work perspective, and what kind of work environment do we imagine ourselves in being transformed? Is that a good thing? Or, transformation is kind of neutral. Like, in terms of a term, you could transform into a terrible thing. And I don't think we talk about that. Like, for me, I don't even think we talk about learning and, like, just increasing, like, redundancy is something we actively eliminate in companies now.
Yeah.
And so, this is something Goldrat would talk about is how short-sighted labor reduction initiatives are, because they'll see a market turn down and want to get ahead of it by cutting labor. And instead of understanding that it's probably not necessarily the market turn down you think it is, it's that whoever your customer is still going to need to buy things at some point. So the idea is how long can you go, or can they go, without restocking inventory? And starting to take more of this view that it's actually better use of capital to preserve systems as they are, rather than this tear down, tear up thing that we seem to do on a quarterly basis in this country. Like, it's terrible. And so we strand a lot of workforce. And right now, we're seeing the results of not being able to learn at work in adjacent tasks. We have to bring everybody from overseas. And we also notice that, like, the education systems aren't calibrated around this very well either. So I don't know. I think it's multidimensional, but if you stop the ability to learn at work by over-focusing and over-functionalizing, and then you wonder why you can't transform, because transformation to me is about skills adjacency. You're probably not going to have all the skills, but how close can you get the folks to it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the idea of whole work is so interesting in that it's partially about kind of feedback loop closure too, right? Like, one of the things Trist kind of noticed when they changed the way that mining was happening was that, in essence, someone doing a task couldn't see the effect of the task on the next crew that came in. So, the really simple version of it is that they move from small crews where everybody is working together directly, so everybody can see what everybody else is doing and they can understand how they're interacting. They move from that to a system where there are multiple crews who have specialized tasks, like a dynamite crew and a structure crew. And
the overarching principle is that local optimizations will not necessarily optimize the whole. Right?
Right, but it's also the way that the local optimizations make it so you can't see the effect of your work on someone else's work. So, like, the feedback loops don't close correctly, right? So, like, you can't see that the way that you just dynamited doesn't help the people who need to now extract the coal, and there's no feedback loop there, right? And so I think
it's hard to care when you don't know.
It's hard to care when you don't know.
That's true.
It's also I think one of the things that I like about socio-technical systems theory is that, like, there's so much emphasis nowadays on, like, customer centricity and understanding who your customer is and kind of market feedback and stuff like that. But, so the socio-technical systems design is about the interactions inside the business as much as it is about the interactions between the business and the environment that it lives in, right? So it's like a multiple thing that needs to be kind of resolved, so that, again, like, operators and people who are further away from the front lines of the work being deployed into the market, those people need to know how they can be heroes and how they get feedback and what their work is for, just as much as people who are, like, delivering stuff directly to the market, I guess. So I don't know. I think it's interesting.
Well, there's a lot of conversations about psychological safety, and there's a lot of causal factors for that. But I think one of the primitive kind of leftovers from Taylor thinking that's in our organization, there's a lot of them. And not all of them are bad, by the way, from my perspective. Like, we couldn't have Toyota without Taylor. Fortunately, they moved on from that. But I think from the standpoint of breaking up tasks into small pieces, the hyper-functionalism, a great example I see is in actually in the 80s when client server happened, right? We went from having some tech people that were generalists to having now I need somebody who understands this idea of a server. I need somebody who understands the idea of a network. I need somebody who understands the idea of client applications. And I need somebody who understands the idea of server applications. I need a database person. All of these specialties emerged in the 80s and really divided up a very simple set of concepts that, not people didn't understand, but they didn't have to think about on a daily basis. And so all those specialties led to very much a hyper-functionalization inside of groups that ran technology. And so it creates a knowledge economy. People believe largely that they're hired for what they know and what their experience was. And in a socio-technical system, there's not only that assumption that you're hired for some skill, but there's also an assumption that you want to expand that skill. And you're going to want to learn things about things that are around you, and you may not always want to do that job. And you should understand the other jobs because they inform how you do yours. And I think that that relationship is very important. And as we hyper-functionalize, we see we saw kind of a backlash against that with DevOps and a lot of people railing about silos. And I think that we all do need some sort of notion of focus. And I say that, silos are like blinders on horses in some cases to keep us focused and not dealing with all the things around us. The problem we ran into in this more modern way of working from a socio-technical perspective is that we don't need as much of a blinder. Like we need maybe a 180-degree view as opposed to a 30-degree view. And that's what's changed, is that aperture has opened up. And
you don't need the blinder, and you have the technology to facilitate that wider context.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like right now, right? We could be in a room or limited to the people that are in a room, but we're not.
Kevin, I have a thought. I don't know if this question, maybe JB, you could also contribute. You mentioned about psychological safety, and we're kind of talking about technical systems. We're talking about processes. We're kind of sort of touching upon people, but it seems like we're holding ourselves from talking about going to those people. So for example, psychological safety is what? It's a shared belief that the team, is safe, for interpersonal risk taking.
Yep.
I mean, that's the crux of it, right? When transformation is taking place, what is the role of culture? Do leaders understand? And how are we facilitating that? Because just today I had a session around bringing, strengthening our open organization. And we were talking at a very high level, at a very broad level. And everybody had intellectually the understanding of what psychological safety is, because we are working with smart people. But during the sessions, when we were asking some tough questions about how do you give feedback, how do you hold each other accountable, what is the level of trust within the group, it was evident that some hot buttons were being pushed, So I think we need to talk a little bit more about transformation and behaviors and the real things that happen within the teams, within that transformation journey. So I would love to hear some stories from you about your experiences.
Well, I can tell you some things that executives do that don't help psychological safety. One of the key indicators in my mind of broad psychological safety issues in an organization is the formation of tribes inside of the organization. In other words, the notion that inside the company there are enemies or people that could hurt you, or if you are not noticed and protected, you do not have the ability to take those chances that you were talking about. And so, in the classic enterprise, I see the functional definitions of your role being very tight. So I'm not allowed, or I would have to ask 10 people before I could try a thing, right, in digital transformation. So I think that limited mobility from a learning and a chance to see other work is really, really unsettling for people when you talk about transformation, because this notion that the company is going to radically change, and typically executives create burning platform style motivation for transformations. We have to do this. We have to become a different, and all these words, different, agile, they use all these words that people, they kind of conjure fear because they're speed words, they're quality words, and they know the execs maybe don't know what that means. But here's the thing, if I have a very narrowly defined job and the company transforms, where am I? So in transformation, one of the psychological safety things that I think is absolutely critical is foreshadowing way before a transformation gets announced and talking about the possibilities and exciting things on the other side of a transformation and giving examples. Today, if you're a network engineer, here are all the things that are open to you. I really think that when we paint transformations in technology, we're so focused on being able to do a new thing or having capabilities that we forget that the people that make those things work, that actually make them provide value, need to have a basic feeling like I'm valuable, the company knows it, and I can try things because I'm valuable, and like I can make mistakes because I'm valuable. And, and even if I don't know as much as everybody else, I'm valued. And I think that inclusiveness all comes with like a backdrop of what am I being included in? And I think, when we talk about psychological safety, there are always going to be people that take risks, and there are going to be people that maybe don't want to take as many risks.
Yeah,
and
because there's an issue with when we have digital transformation, I could lose my job. So what are you talking about risk?
Well, especially when a large amount of them are paid for by actual job cuts and position elimination, right? And so in many cases, these actions can create massive talent shortages in organizations that were never there. They just didn't allow people to learn and slide in an org in a way where the organization can get the best out of them and they can get the best out of the organization. And so some flexibility goes a long, long way. And then here's the other thing I don't think we often do from a sobriety standpoint. Think about, and honestly, have a meeting one day about the largest changes that your organization has been through, and then step back from them and say, how did that make us feel? Not whether it was successful. We all know that every big organizational change is deemed as successful by somebody, or otherwise.
Did you just say feel? Did you bring in that dirty word?
The dirty word feel,
Kevin?
right? And, how do you feel about those things? And then if we're talking about making a larger change than the largest change we've made, and the changes that we made that were large didn't go well, I think we have to have some sobriety and say, maybe we break this up into stuff that we're more able to do it.
I think a lot of organizations aren't honest about what well means, right? And people will declare victory regardless of the outcome, because so much of their careers, so much of the finances are invested in a particular thing that they're not going to allow anyone to say anything is not a victory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could it be a relationship between power and fear that kind of goes hand in hand?
Yeah, like you're taking something at somebody else's expense.
Hey guys, thanks for letting me join in. But KB, you said something that triggered me from when I broke into the business.
I've been accused of that before.
No, I mean, I remember in the 80s, late 80s, when I was already in a couple of years from the old mini computer transition. So I was like 19 when I first started programming on minis, but when it's undergraduate doing co-ops, and then I got full-time in 88. I was not a mainframe guy. I was just on the cusp of punch cards. So, we were in the pre-Linux. It was Unix dominated by AT&T. And I remember going in and looking at all the old guys back then and saying they're hugging their mainframes. And they didn't want to change because they didn't want the job security to be lost. They specifically were on job security.
Yep.
I was just like, are you freaking kidding me? I'm never going to use punch cards, and I'm never going to do that. That's so old and antiquated. Client server was cooler. Ethernet was coming on Pike. And so at that time, it was clear business benefit to go to mainframe. I mean, mini. Mm-hmm. So I think that to me was what I see a lot here going on, where there's a little bit of that, and it's a little bit kind of a bad analogy because we're past that. But DevOps that Andrew was pointing out in his talk reminds me of what full stack developers became. Because full stack developers became the 10x developer. Now with cloud, it's the half stack developer, I call it, because you don't need the full stack because you got half stack in the cloud. So now you have a full DevOps model where you're going faster. So I think the younger people coming in are looking at me and saying, I'm technically not a boomer, but I'm a Gen Xer on the cusp. But still, they look at me and say, I don't need no stinking, full stack developer. I'm just going to sling containers and Kubernetes, and I'm going to be faster and better. And so I think there's real psychology and tech change that looks like that. So to me, I see a lot of that pattern where some people just want to write code and be application developers. They have nothing to do with infrastructure. Some people want to geek out and make the routes better, do policy and all those kind of cool infrastructure things.
Exactly.
That were managed by gatekeepers, the network guy or this person. And so I think that's a complete psychological and mindset that differentiates who's going to win. The people hugging their old stuff is going to die.
We should get John and do a bit of a three economies breakdown, because a lot of what he's describing, in my opinion, is this recombinating in the three economies to resolve the dilemmas that we see in all the organizations.
Totally. Yeah, I think I think the first thing I would talk about is the idea that psychological safety, trust, or another term for it in academia is what's called social capital. All these ideas actually enable people to do things in certain organizations that they can't do in other organizations. So the reason that in academia we call it social capital is because it's literally like capital. It is literally something that you can use to do things. Trust is something you can use to do things that if you don't have it, you can't do it. And I think one of the kind of most difficult things for people to kind of process through or think through is the idea that you can't build trust unless you take risk. There's a relationship where trust comes from engaging in risky activities with other people. So it's not, if you and I have an agreement that we're going to do something and there's no risk involved in that agreement, it doesn't create trust between us. It just maybe become better friends, we have a good time, whatever, but we don't actually create more social capital inside the organization. And in relationship to power, then you get things like the idea that political capital is a variant of social capital. And the weird thing about political capital is this. People talk about spending political capital all the time, but it in fact is never spent. It is because if you spend political capital, if you exercise political power and you are able to back up that power with enough force to get your will complete, you didn't spend anything. It cost you anything. In fact, you gained more political capital in that exercise. It's only the people who try to do something that can't back it up that actually lose in the long run. Anyway, there's all sorts of interesting, weird things to talk about with kind of power dynamics and stuff like that. But I think that when you look at transformations, one of the tricks is to try to figure out how to level out the power indifferences inside of organizations so that people can have conversations about things that need to change, things that we're not aware of yet, things where expertise isn't necessarily what will make the decision now, because we actually have to work together to construct a new understanding of what the organization is and what its purpose is. And that doesn't require someone telling us what those purposes are. It requires a bunch of new conversations and activities and practices and stuff like that. And that all requires a lot of trust, I think. So I don't know.
Yeah, Dave, you're really hitting on something, which is a transition of power, right? It's really morphing that power from a control to more generative, or definitely more. Yeah.
So I think there's a negative feedback loop a positive feedback loop that causes negative outcomes. I always get those confused. Positive feedback loops always amplify, negative ones dampen, right? But there's a positive feedback loop that causes negative behavior. And it's really simple. The way I usually explain it is in any organization with 3 levels, if the peer levels, the lowest levels, if the peer levels can't negotiate, they will go to their immediate supervisor, right? And if their immediate supervisors can't actually negotiate, then they go up one more level. Once you get to the 3rd level, then all the decisions are made simply based on power, because there's no way that those people have enough information about what's happening at the ground level to actually make useful decisions, right? So there's variants of that where the answer is yes, there are things that executives know about and things that they're responsible for that are probably not appropriate to be decided on at the lowest level. The problem is when you bring up too many of these conversations up into the organizational stack. And the result of that is that you shred the social fabric of the organization by doing this, right? You basically
also add a different framing. When you think about how we talk about cloud native architectures and moving to kind of distributed databases and the trade-offs in the cap there in between consistency and availability, essentially what you're doing is an organizational trade-off between consistency and availability.
Yeah.
Right? So if you push more decision making to the edge, then you're allowing people to do things, and you're going to have more work done, quote unquote, availability, but you're not necessarily going to have consistency. And so with that framing, you could talk about things like when you have a meeting, that's a write lock, right? So you have like a team level meeting, an all hands meeting is a global write lock. And
yep.
I don't know.
Or a read lock at the beginning.
Or Uber.
And
Yeah,
I actually like to riff off of that. I like to say that the result of this kind of bubbling up thing when it goes wrong is that the executives actually get DDoSed. Like they're just actually overwhelmed by decisions they shouldn't be making. And they're being asked to process information that they don't have access to and they can't really make decisions on. So like Kevin and I used to teach executives this. I call it a decision economy. And you basically write down every decision you have to make each day, right? Like every time someone comes in and asks you a question, you had to make a decision on, you write it down. And then you have 2 columns next to it. Interesting, uninteresting. So interesting questions would be things where you'd look at it and you go, I'm glad you guys brought me that question. That was really interesting. I enjoyed participating in it, and I thought that I actually might have added some value. Uninteresting ones are like, I don't know why you brought me this question. Clearly you should have answered it yourselves. But then the trick for the executive after that is then to actively work to figure out how to make less uninteresting questions come up the chain to them. And that's not by going around yelling at people and saying, don't come into my office. It's by saying, like, why did people think that I should be making these decisions, and what can I actively do inside the organization to actively distribute it? So it's not just it's like looking for examples of the statement, I want to distribute decision making, by actually looking for examples of this decision here that I just talked about should have been distributed. How do we make that work better? So I found that really useful when I was an executive. I did it a lot.
Well, and the converse side of, kind of taking things up the chain, a reporting chain, is that there's an interesting correlation between the length or the height rather of the reporting chain and the types of decisions that are being made. And so literally when a person escalates a decision up to somebody who makes 5 to 6 to 7 year long type of decisions, those are the decisions that are interesting to them. That's a totally different time frame to think about. And those are there's a lot less 5-year decisions that you're going to make than the hyper expanding list of tactical things that are going to fly by like log files on a firewall, right? And so I think the key is never turn on debug, right? But the key is that you also stop the organization from learning how to make those decisions at the lower end, which reinforces learned helplessness. We can't do this. We have to go ask somebody to move the cheese, right? And so 2 things are happening. That person at the top is making decisions that are not in their ideal time frame. And like Jay was saying, they get fatigued by the amount of them. And in their mind, why do people have to ask me this question? And so you wind up having them make a bunch of terrible decisions, and actually in many cases forestall or actually push off large decisions. And so the consequence of that is that the exec feels like operations are happening in their office. And that's not okay. That creates anxiety for them, and it creates the notion that we have performance problems in middle management. So, and then, they put pressure on middle management, and it just becomes this ever reinforcing loop of somebody's not doing the right thing because I'm making all the wrong decisions. So what you will see then is reporting structures get adjusted to isolate those decisions down to regional people, which then causes regional customizations and optimizations. But I mean, the long story short is if an organization can't figure out the kinds of decisions that it needs to make to operate and be conscious about it, and put those decisions at the time horizons where people are the most comfortable and have skill, it's not an organization. It's just...
Kevin, you just made me think about, when you're talking about decision-making, I just can't help think about the open decision-making at Red Hat that we do. The whole idea of involving and engaging people who do the job, who are involved in the process, and how decision-making doesn't happen, right on top, but it's really happening at a much different level or at a different level. And that is, again, a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with skill. It has also willingness of the leaders to allow that for that kind of decision making to happen. The question that I have, maybe you could help me think about it, is like transformation and open decision making. How could we make that fit in a way, especially when there are pressures around time, when we want decisions to be taken fast, or do they need to be taken as fast as we assume?
Yeah.
No, I've had better luck with that. Just as a frontline employee, making a decision, but realizing leadership is on a different time scale for me, and making sure they have time to catch me if they don't like what I'm doing. I've tried it the other way too, where it was more catch me if you can, which can be fun, but doesn't build trust. And that pulls it back to that point that if you don't have frontline employees, I'll say, in a position where they can make decisions and take that risk, they never feel they've earned the trust to do it. So they're always deferring that to someone else.
So like one of the things I like to think about, Shubnor, is I like to think about this idea that people think of decisions in very specific ways. And one of the ways they tend to think of decision making or decisions is they think that like people are like, I don't know, I don't want to push the metaphor too much, but like people are little computers and they get information and they use they have certain algorithms in their head and they use the information to make the decisions, right? And one of the arguments would be like some people who work closer to the coal face, so they work closer to the actual line, either they have access to specific types of information, they're closer to specific kinds of information, and or because they do it a lot, they have access to or they practice certain algorithms or certain practices or behaviors, so they know those things better, right? One of the other ways to kind of think through it, though, is that actually what happens inside organizations is that people want to have like a meaningful experience every day. They want to come to work and know what they're doing, and they want that thing that they're doing to be meaningful. They want to know what they're doing. And so if you walk up to most people in an organization, you say, hey, like, what are you doing today? A lot of people can tell you what they're doing. They can generally say like, hey, I'm working on this project or that project and things like that. But if you ask different people in the organization, you'll get slightly different stories, and you get different stories based on where they are in the hierarchy in the organization. So like most like scrummy people who are doing some sort of agile scrummy thing, they're going to give you like a 2-week story. They're going to tell you what's happening this week. Yeah. And that's great. And they're going to tell you, and certain things fit in those stories, right? Like you get like 5-10 minutes to tell your story to somebody who's going to listen before they get bored. So there can only certain details fit in those stories, and that's what it is. You go and you talk to an executive and you say, hey, what are you doing? And he's going to tell you, he or she's going to tell you like a story that lasts like maybe a year, maybe 2 years. This is like what we're doing right now is this. And if you go and talk to a middle manager, most of the time, they're going to tell you, hey, we're doing this quarter, or we're going to do this for the next 2 quarters, right? And so what you get is actually different narratives throughout the organization that represent what I'm making decisions about, right? Because like I'm in a story and things are happening to me, and this is the way the story is supposed to play out. So I'm making decisions not based on information or not based on skills, but on how I understand how the world is supposed to play out in my story, right?
John, I think you just posted Zoom publicly, and I would.
Yeah, because we're getting near the end, and then we're getting questions. I have to approve them coming in anyway.
Okay, I sent one of the.
Can't get in unless I.
Okay, cool.
I'm not keeping up with all the sort of requests, so I'm a terrible administrator.
The way that this.
Need a better boss.
The way that this kind of story goes wrong is that in a lot of organizations, what ends up happening is that when there's a lack of trust, the Peter principle is like I get promoted into the level of skill that I'm effective at, and then I get promoted one more time, and then I'm no longer effective, so I don't get promoted anymore, but I also don't get demoted. Another way to think through that same activity is that people get promoted into different levels of storytelling. And in theory, their stories should get longer and longer, and they should contain different details, different kinds of things. But what ends up happening is when people get promoted, if they don't know how to tell those new stories, they will often go back and start telling the smaller stories that they used to tell. And so micromanagement in this kind of narrative-based version of how organizations work is not someone coming and telling you what to do, but someone coming and telling you why what you're doing is meaningful in a way that you don't get to create meaning in your job anymore. You don't get to own your own story. So if you have these smaller stories that fit inside the bigger stories, you actually can create your own narrative. You can talk about how what you're doing at work is contributing to a larger and larger purpose. so many organizations that we go into, though, have had this collapse. And the result of it is that you get, CIOs and CTOs who are telling like quarter-long stories. They're not giving the people who work for them the space to create a narrative about their work. And therefore, they destroy the trust. Yeah.
You just hit it on the head. Why is the CEO giving this story? Why aren't the people that were actually physically doing that giving the story of what went great? Like if CIOs would bring those individuals in and have them share the story of what's going great, what would happen? You'd have this huge ripple effect. Everybody's going to want it. Everybody's going to want to be trying that new thing. They're going to be sharing with each other. They're going to have open conversations. The decisions can be made right there, right then and there.
But I also think that when you get this collapse, you get this other weird effect, Chris, which is that because different things are in each type of different story, when you get a collapse, nobody starts paying attention to the long-term stories anymore. There's no long-term narrative, and that becomes a problem. But what ends up generally happening, I find, is that in organizations, the board will pull the executives back up to longer term scales. Because they'll be like, you got to be telling me what's going to happen over the year or 2 year frame. You can't stop telling me little stories. You got to tell me big stories. The middle managers are the people who get left behind, and they tend to collapse down into these smaller narratives. And the result of that is that you get executives telling stories to other executives, and therefore the parts of the stories all fit together and they make sense to the other executives, but they're very, very rarely telling those stories to the staff, right? Same thing, the staff is very rarely telling the stories to the executives. And the result of this is really weird. If you take almost any CIO and you put them in the middle of like a sprint planning process, every time I've done it, the CIO comes out and is like, I have no idea what those people were talking about. They don't really understand what they're doing. They're not telling the right types of stories. They're not paying attention to the right things. On the other hand, if you take a person who's used to doing sprint planning for 2 weeks and you put them up in a boardroom, they would say the same thing. What are these people talking about? None of the stuff they're talking about makes any sense. It doesn't matter. What are we going to do this week and next week? So it's actually kind of like the interlinking of the multiple levels that it becomes important. And when you lose the middle management, when you lose that kind of 6 month frame, you get a collapse. And the collapse is that the lower parts of the organization, the parts of the organization doing the work, don't have any idea what the strategy is or why it exists. And it doesn't make any sense to them. And the executives think, I'm brilliant because I've explained my strategy to a bunch of other executives and they know what I'm saying. So what's wrong with the people who won't listen to me? And that cycle kicks off an amazing round of everyone pointing fingers at everyone else as to why we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, I feel like
also we don't know what we're doing, so there's that little problem. Sorry, Chris.
No, it's the time scale piece is important. I think I've had some luck looking at a scope of story, and is the story accurate, and are we delving into detail too soon? That if I have an accurate story and some ability to fill in the details, where in the org are those details getting fleshed out? And that gets back into that micromanagement. It is really hard to get people to step away from the time constraint, though.
So I just think, like, Shebner, to go back to your question really quickly, like, part of the problem, part of the question ends up being in an open org, who's sharing what? Like, it doesn't, like, unless you actually link these things together in purposeful ways, sharing or transparency is not necessary. It's a lot like that DDoSing problem. Are you sharing information that's meaningful to me? Are your stories the same types of stories I tell, so I can understand how you tell the story and make sense of them? Can I link my story to your larger story in some sort of meaningful way that I actually can see progress? All of these questions ends up being like beyond just being open and transparent, are we actually having a conversation? Are we communicating something to each other that is helping us move the organization forward? Are we creating links and concepts like that?
And I think this is exactly where we need the systems and frameworks and structures, but often we tilt so much, towards structures and frameworks that we forget the purpose that those structures and frameworks were created in the first place.
Yeah, I agree.
So we did this for an hour. Should we do it again?
I thought
Great. Yeah, this is great. Thank you for doing this. It made my morning.
We'll be a little more organized next time. John, if you got, that's your tool, right?
Crowd chat, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe if there's like some hints and tips, maybe we can get on a call.
Yeah, so when you use, by the way, this is a great new feature. You can embed the stream on the crowd chat, so it's like a group container.
Oh, okay, all right, brilliant.
No pun intended. But on your end, on the Global Transformation YouTube channel, there's a flag on the account where you have to make it embeddable. So it works on a browser, but if you try to embed it like in WhatsApp or whatever and try to play it, it says playback error.
Okay.
So it's really effective if you want to do that, but it's great. Glad you're recording this. This is phenomenal.
It's a great tool, man. Gene's been using it forever, and then I thought, man, wouldn't it be great to start doing it?
Yeah, we're going to open it up, I think, and try to get some community development on it. It's been a fun project, but
yeah,
this transformation message
We all
hits
stopped
home.
typing though when we started talking.
Yeah, well, we got to get better at the mixture there, right? So some of the great stuff that was going on here was not being captured on Twitter, but I think we'll work that out. Plus, we have this archive. So.
Yeah, we have software. You guys want to use it? We're going to open it up to the community. We have the Cube 365, which is much more of a different platform. It's all cloud native, but we've been transforming. Our business has been fun, stressful, but this whole story resonates with me because the events are all changing, and it has the same software thing because the roles are changing and the responsibilities are changing, how decisions are made, and everyone's judging performance on an inadequate support system. In other words, they just transform and they didn't actually think about the architecture of who does what and the decision making. Everything fails.
You said about the events. I feel like right now we're in this phase where people are trying to translate the way that events worked in real life onto these virtual medium, and it just feels like a long webinar, and I think there's
flawed.
Yeah, we can find ways to explore the possibility of these media and better experiences, more engaging experiences.
We're learning, so you guys who play with us, help us.
I'm late for the next meeting, and I'm the host, so.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
So the next meeting's late.
Yeah.
It's fun.
See you later.
Thank you.
Later.
Bye.